priest, prophet, and king start to get blurred, right? I think I mentioned that. They're very distinctive offices, right? And you could be prophetic in your role as king or in your role as priest, but you can't be the priest and the king at the same time. Those two are separated. They're absolutely separated. And the problem is that Samuel, the priest, tells Saul that he would come and offer sacrifices to God in preparation for the battle to come, and Saul got impatient. So Samuel's old by this point, and he's traveling like on foot, long distances, and he's late. Literally he's late by a little while. And when he gets there, he realizes that Saul had already made the offering that only the priest could make. Right, so this is a big deal. So picture this. Sunday, you go to church, and the bells ring, so you think it's 8 o'clock or whatever time you go to church, and the priest is running late. So someone randomly gets up and comes to the altar and begins mass. People would have a huge problem with that, right? Nobody's going to be okay with that, because that's not your job, that's mine. And that's just it. It's a specific job, right? Which I have that no one else can do. Just a priest, nobody wants it. It's just, that's the way we're set up in our church. That was what was happening back then. Saul got up, made the sacrifice, blew everybody away probably, thinking, what is he doing? Samuel comes and says, what have you done? What have you done? This is not okay. He literally did something that he was not allowed to do. He had crossed the line. The Lord, it says then, he says to him, the Lord has sought out a man after his own heart who will succeed you. In other words, your son is not going to be the next king of this country because of what you did. Mistake number one. He made 2 mistakes. And so he says, your son, basically, God is going to find somebody to succeed you, not from your own line. And then he walked away. Samuel is very good at saying something and then walking away and leaving you standing there in shock. And so mistake number 2 comes. The Amalekites were God's people's enemies from the time that they had come out of Egypt. And the thing I can summarize it by saying this. As the Israelites were making their way into the desert after 400 years of slavery, they're carrying everything that they own, and they're exhausted, and they're beaten down. And Amalek, the Amalekites, are named obviously for him, attacked them from the back. He attacked them from the back, which is crappy anyway. You stab somebody in the back. He literally attacked the weakest people in the Israelites, the people who were the slowest. And I would say grandma in her wheelchair and Tiny Tim with his crutch were in the back. And that's who Amalek attacked. He was a coward. And so from then on, God said, I want Amalek completely destroyed. I want to wipe him out of the history books. I want to wipe him out just completely wipe him out. And it still hadn't happened. So there's still, every once in a while, they come up against the Amalekites. And so Saul was told through the prophet Samuel, you are to annihilate Amalek, the Amalekites, and every single thing of theirs. You are not to take any of their belongings. You are not to keep any of their livestock. You're to wipe them completely out from the face of the earth. Leave nothing. Destroy them completely. But Saul did not do that. This is mistake number 2. He kept the best of the herds and the flocks. And he kept some of his stuff too. He broke the commandment. And Samuel shows up, and Samuel's great. I can't wait to meet Samuel someday. Hopefully we'll meet him in heaven, right? And he comes into the camp of Saul, and to make sacrifices and whatever he's going to do there, celebrate this great victory over Amalek. And he hears, bah, moo. He hears animals making sounds. And I think Samuel's got a really good personality, and he says, oh, that's funny. I must be hearing something because, it feels like there's sheep and cows around here somewhere. But of course there can't be, right? Because you killed them all, right? You destroyed Amalek, right? Well, not quite, right? So, but he did it very sarcastically, like, I must be hearing things. It sounds like sheep bleating, and cows mooing. Well, that's what it is. And he says, that's it. You're done. And he turns to go, and Saul reaches out and rips his cloak in half. And he turns to him in true Samuel form and says, just as that you have ripped that piece of cloth from my cloak, the Lord is going to rip the kingdom from you and your family forever. Right? So from that moment on, things are not going to be good for Saul. In the very next chapter, God comes to Samuel and says, go down, get your horn full of oil, and go down to Jesse's house in Bethlehem, because from his sons, I'm going to choose the next king of this country. So he's serious. Saul's line is done. They're not going to take over. Somebody else is going to. And this is Jesse, as you know, is the father of King David. And I know when we were kids, we would have like in Advent, the Jesse tree, and it was all about the Old Testament. It was all these people. You would make ornaments that had to do with like Noah and the ark, or Adam and Eve, or whoever. Jesse is also the grandson of Ruth, who we talked about a couple weeks ago. Ruth. God tells Samuel to go, and he'll give him a sign from among the sons of David, or Jesse. And so he says to Jesse, one of your sons is going to be the next king of this country. So that's the best news of all for a father to hear, right? One of my sons is going to be the king, right? And he says, yep. So get them all in here. We're going to have a big party, and God's going to give me a sign of which one it is. So he lines them all up, and he looks. No, he sees the first one, strapping, handsome, muscular, but no sign. Second, no sign. Third, he goes all the way down the line, 7 or 8 sons, and he says, there's no sign. So he goes back to the beginning, and he looks again and again and again. He's looking for like some neon arrow pointing at the sun, but no arrow comes. So what does he say? To Jesse, he turns and he says the very reasonable question, do you have any more children? Right? And he says, yes. Well, why isn't he in here? Why didn't he get invited? Well, he's the youngest, David. He's like number 8. So, nobody thinks number 8 is going to be important. The youngest always, right? And he says, and this is important, he's out with shepherding the sheep. He's a shepherd, which is important too. He's the only one in the family doing his job, right? And he's called in, and immediately the bells and whistles go off, and Samuel anoints him right in the presence of his brothers. We just had this reading at Mass just last week, with 2 weeks ago with the blind man, the anointing of the blind man. That was the first reading, was David getting anointed by Samuel. He anoints him, and this is cool and sad at the same time, because I feel bad for the guy who loses everything. That's just me. The Spirit of the Lord, it says, rushed upon him as it had Saul when he was anointed. But what you don't really, the part of the story that nobody realizes is it left Saul. The Spirit of God left Saul and rushed upon David in another part of the country. And unfortunately, an evil spirit came and descended into Saul's self. So he was tortured by an evil spirit that would show rear its ugly head every once in a while, and it'd drive him crazy. It made him paranoid. It made him anxious. It made him have convulsions sometimes. There's all kind of stuff that just happened to him because of that. For the rest of his life, he's tormented by an evil spirit, because when the Spirit of God left him and went into David, this other spirit saw an opportunity and went into him. which is really sad. But one thing, this is really cool how God works, right? So the music is the only thing that calmed the king, and it seemed to calm this spirit, okay? It seemed to suppress the evil spirit. It would drive it down. And the king was also soothed by this, so they found a musician, and lo and behold, it's David, the shepherd boy. The shepherd boy who's going to be king someday was also a musician and a songwriter, right? Because he wrote a lot of the Psalms in the book of Psalms. There's 150 Psalms, and like a great number of them, I don't know how many, are attributed to David. It actually says which ones are in the Bible. It'll say a Psalm of David. So David is a musician that they bring in from Bethlehem to play for the king, and he can soothe and he suppresses the evil spirits. And while he's there, he wins the favor of the king. The king really enjoys his company, and he makes him his armor bearer also. So he's his right-hand man. So David, the next king that nobody's, this is all a secret still though. They didn't tell Saul that he was going to be the king, but he's right in the king's house. He's right next to the current king. And isn't it interesting, and I love this, that David, the ancestor of Jesus, was able to subdue evil spirits just like Jesus could do. Now, it wasn't the same. David is not the Son of God, like in the same way that Jesus is. But centuries before Christ, 1,000 years before Jesus, his ancestor David and his music was able to suppress the evil spirits. He wasn't able to drive them away like Jesus could, but he could suppress them to the point that it would help the king. So again, Jesus will drive them literally out of people. But David kind of has like a certain amount of that, which I love. I love that. And I honestly just realized that this year. I thought, that weird. Like I never even thought about that he was able to kind of do that, right? So Saul was very fond of David, and he has him fighting right alongside of him all the time. And the Philistines, that group that had come off the coast and had made its way into the Holy Land, rallied their forces, and they're going to fight the Israelites. And we know the story. It's David and Goliath. I don't need to tell you the whole story. It's the giant, right? Goliath is a giant, like the biggest warrior ever, and he's got a helmet, armor from head to toe, swords and a javelin, like a spear that he'll throw at you, drive right through a person, shields, boots. He's completely almost completely protected, obviously. And David goes out wearing not much, right? Not much at all, like a loincloth and his 5 little stones that he picks up right off the desert floor. And he says because Goliath is literally laughing at this kid. And he says, you want to taunt me? And he's kind of making fun of God and things like that. And David says, you come at me with shield and javelin, sword, but I come to you in the name of God the Most High. And he kills him right there. Well, he kills him with a stone in his forehead. And then he goes over, this is really ballsy, he goes over and in front of the entire Philistine army, he grabs his head and he picks up his sword and he chops his head off right there and whips it at the people, who then run away. They took flight, it says. They took flight. And then something happens and we can see where Saul has all these issues. So Saul is the king, and David is the king's right-hand man, and everybody's super happy that they won this battle, and David's great, and nobody's questioning that. But as they're riding their horses or whatever in parade into the city is full of people, and they're singing, and the women are singing songs, and they sing the song that says basically, Saul has killed thousands. And Saul's like, yeah, because he knows he's a good warrior too. And it says, and David has killed tens of thousands. He's like, what did they say? He's jealous. He's green with envy. I say to the kids, what's the color of envy? And they don't know. So it's green, green with envy. You got to teach them. I said they all turned green. He turned green with envy. And he begins to now dislike him. Or even, he's threatened by him. Kings are threatened, obviously, all the time. The problem is that David's best friend, like best friend, loved each other so much, is Saul's son Jonathan. Saul has 4 or 5 kids that we know of. And his one son, Jonathan, and David are like bosom buddies. They are absolute best friends forever. And they've actually like made oaths to each other and promises to each other that they're going to protect each other forever, the rest of their lives, and down through the generations. And it's wonderful, to have a best friend like that. It said David was the ivories and Jonathan was the ebony, like the keys on a piano. And they were just amazing together. And Jonathan says, my dad is going to kill you. My dad is now plotting to kill you. Even though you're this great hero, and you've done nothing ever to deserve this, but those women's songs put it in my dad, and the evil spirits at work in this, and we get that. And so David flees. And Saul hunts him down for like years. A couple years pass. In the meantime, Samuel has passed away because he was old. And at least 2 times during those couple years, that Saul is actively pursuing David to kill him for no reason other than he's jealous. At least 2 times David has the opportunity to kill Saul, but he doesn't do it. He says, no, God did not tell me to kill his anointed one. He did not tell me to kill the king. That's not my job. David had trust in God, that God would figure this out. And so the anointed trusts, the true anointed one trusts God. In chapter 26 of 2 Samuel, David calls to Saul from a hillside. Oh, well, let me tell you, the two times it's kind of funny and weird. Like, every once in a while, these little hidden gems of the Bible that people say, are you making that up? The one time, David and some of his men, because he's got a small group of like merry men that's hanging out with him, right? And David comes to a cave, and he and his men are in the cave taking refuge from maybe the weather or whatever. And Saul comes into the cave to pee, right? You know the story, to pee, to urinate. He goes into the cave to urinate, and he doesn't realize that he's literally in the dark surrounded by all these guys. And they're like, kill him. And he says, I'm not going to kill him. He had the opportunity, but he didn't do it. Plus, he's best friends with his son. I mean, it's not as easy as that. And David's just not out to kill in cold blood. It's not what he's called to do. He's trusting in God. The other time, Saul's entire army is all camped out and sleeping on this big level piece of ground. And David and his men sneak right over, and he's literally laying there, asleep. So they say, kill him. He'd never do it. He won't do it. And so he takes his sword and he puts it right next to his head. And when Saul wakes up in the morning, he knows that David was right there, but he did not kill him. So there is a little bit changing in Saul. Saul's paranoid. We know this. He's possessed by an evil spirit. He's, got a lot of issues. And they see each other from 2 hillsides. David's on one hillside and Saul is on another hillside. And he calls out to him and he says, my king, what did I do to you? Like, why are you pursuing me, trying to kill me? I've never done anything but just do my best for you. And Saul acknowledges that. So that's cool. Saul acknowledges that, and he calls back to him and calls him like my son or something like that. So they're not like best friends yet. They're never going to be again, but there's a little bit of reconciliation that happened there. And then Saul is still doomed. We know this. He's going to be doomed to a terrible ending. And what he does is a very bad thing. He he doesn't know, he's losing battles right and left. He's not sure what to do, and he doesn't have a prophet right now to guide him because Samuel died. And Samuel didn't like him anyway. Remember, Samuel dropped the mic at least a couple times and walked away from him, right? He does the unthinkable. So divination or fortune telling or any type of witchcraft or sorcery of any kind is 100% against everything, in God's laws. That is 100% not allowed. And when Saul had taken the kingship, he made sure that all the witches or the sorcerers or whoever, fortune tellers in the country were all suppressed or driven away. But there was one left, and she's called the Witch of Endor. You might have heard of her. Her story is in the scriptures, and he goes in disguise to the Witch of Endor to get advice, and he wants her to conjure a spirit from the grave to come back. It's like, this is bad. This is not going to be good. But you don't know how bad it actually is going to be. So she says, she doesn't know who it is. And he says, I need you to conjure someone for me. And she says, who do you want me to conjure? He says, I want you to conjure the prophet Samuel back from the dead. The guy who hates him, the guy who doesn't like him. But he wants his advice. And he thinks that maybe he'll give him his advice. And all of a sudden, she conjures the spirit of Samuel, who literally rises just right out of the ground and is standing there and says, who conjured me from my rest? Not happy that he conjured him from his rest. And he realizes it's Saul. And there's a little exchange between the two of them. Like, how dare you disrupt my rest from beyond the grave to bring me back? And he says to him, tomorrow, this is not what you want to hear. Tomorrow, you and your sons will be where I am. In other words, you will be dead tomorrow. And they go into battle the next day, and 3 of the sons of Saul are all killed, Jonathan included, the best friend of David. And Saul is wounded by an arrow, and he begs his men to kill him. Because he says, I'm going to die, but if I'm here and the enemy comes and gets me, then they're going to do terrible things to me and torture me and, make a spectacle of me as the king. So kill me, somebody kill me. And nobody will do it because he's the king. I'm not going to kill you. You're the king. And so he falls on his own sword, it says. So he commits suicide, this guy. So like a terrible, sad ending to a relatively sad life, if you really think about it. Saul, I feel bad for the guy. I do. But David does too. David mourns for his king. He does. He knew that eventually the kingdom will be his, but he mostly mourns for his best friend, his brother, like Jonathan. He's like a brother to him. David is anointed king of Judah, the southern kingdom, and Ishbaal is one of Saul's living sons, and he flees to the northern part of Israel, because he's not inheriting the southern part. There's no way. God had already decided that. But he takes over the 10 tribes in the north, and David has the 2 tribes of Judah and Benjamin in the south. And a little while passes, and I don't remember if Ishbaal he was killed. Yes, 2 of David's men went north, killed Ishbaal, the brother of his best friend, who was also dead. And these guys think that the king's going to be super happy, but he has them killed. David has them killed because he says, no, you're not to kill the king. Like, let God be in charge of this. So now there's Israel in the north that was ruled by Ishbaal, and Judah in the south that was ruled by David. But now the 10 tribes in the north don't have a king. And this is a really beautiful moment. They all process down. They haven't done this in centuries. They process down in a configuration like from old times, and they bow to the ground, and they say to David, we want you to be the king over all of us. So for the first time in a long time, like, they were all united. There was a united kingdom, I guess, for the first time, really, if you think about it. I don't know if they were united under Saul, but they're definitely united under. And now he decides to do something that's really cool David says, I need a capital city. The Ark of the covenant is still in Shiloh, which was just where it was always when Samuel was a little kid and all that. But David says, I need to start over. I need to build a kingdom now. God has promised me. I need a new capital, and I need a center of religion too. So he's got this plan that he starts developing, which is really cool. And he found there was one city that did not belong to any of the tribes. One city, it was a Canaanite city that had never been, they had failed to capture or destroy this city during the conquest period, and it was the city of Jerusalem. And he says, that's going to be my new capital. Why? Because he had to find a place that didn't belong to any of the tribes. So no one could say, that he picked our area, we must be like the best. He picked, like Washington, D.C., it's a similar situation, it's its own thing. It doesn't belong to any one state. It's the same with Jerusalem back then. It didn't belong to any one tribe, that city. And so he established his capital there, drove out the Canaanites, and it became the political, and it will be the religious center of David's kingdom. Once he's as firmly established there and has his palace and everything built, then he decides to bring the ark from Shiloh there too. And a really cool thing happens. It's a connection with the Blessed Mother again. There's a lot of connections with the ark and the Blessed Mother. We already talked about that over the last few months, or through last few weeks. They have this giant cart. This is the problem, though. The ark is only ever to be moved on the shoulders of the priests, the Levitical priests. That's how it travels. But nobody really thought about that because it had been so many centuries since it had ever been moved that nobody really was like in tune with that. They get this giant cart that's going to be drawn by animals. They're going to pull this giant cart. They're going to put the ark on it. And there are people walking on the sides of it to protect it. And the cart begins to rock, and someone puts their hand out and touches the ark to steady it and drops dead on the spot because you don't touch the ark. Only the Levitical priests could touch the ark and carry it on their shoulders. And it says that for 3 months, they said, wait a minute, let's just keep this here for now. Let's rethink what we did. We have to figure out what did we do wrong. And it took them 3 months to figure it out. And it says that the ark remained in the house of Obed-Edom in the hill country of Judea. 3 months in this house in the hill country of Judea until they figured out, oh my gosh, it has to be carried by the priests. That's the only way it can be safely, and everyone together safe. Nobody gets killed by touching it, right? So Obed-Edom's house is in the hill country of Judah. And when Mary is told by Angel Gabriel that she's going to be the mother of the Savior, and by the way, your cousin Elizabeth is pregnant, 6 months, right? Pregnant in the hill country of, it says Mary went in haste to the hill country of Judea. She didn't go to Obed-Edom's house, that's 1,000 years ago. But she went to the same geographic place. And how long did she says Mary remained with her for 3 months. The ark stayed there for 3 months, just like Mary stayed there for 3 months, like 1,000 years later. So, pretty cool. Mary's the new ark. When all was ready, David led the ark into the city, leaping before it, wearing nothing but a loincloth, a linen loincloth. He was basically with no clothes on, jumping around, clad in a linen ephod, it's called. And you can connect that with Jesus on the cross. You can definitely connect that jumping, that leaping, right, with John the Baptist, leaping for joy, right, in the womb of his mother when Jesus comes. So when the ark is brought into Jerusalem, is like when Mary brings the unborn Jesus into the presence of John the Baptist, he jumps for joy, right? Jumps for joy in the womb. David's leaping for joy before the presence of the Lord. And David is sending a very clear message here that unlike Saul, who didn't want to follow God but wanted to lead only, David is sending a message that the real king is who is behind me. Like, yes, I'm a king, I have a crown, I have a breastplate, I have boots, and I have royal robes and everything, but I'm going to take that all off, and I'm going to jump for joy and dance down the street before the real king, which is the God of Israel. His wife, who happens to be one of Saul's daughters, but remember, David never did anything to Saul. Remember, David is guilt-free of anything that ever happened to the king. His wife ridiculed him for jumping, and she said basically, oh, I'm sure every woman in town loved to see you jumping basically naked down the street. Because he was really good looking and very well built. And she said, I'm sure that they loved every minute of that. And he said, you know what, stop. He said, I did what I did and I don't take it back, because he had joy and true love for God. And that's why no matter what mistakes David makes, he's always called a man after God's own heart. And we can all be a man after or a woman after God's own heart, because when we make mistakes like David did, and his were big, some of his mistakes are big, he understands repentance, he understands forgiveness, he understands God's heart, right? God makes a covenant with David. This is covenant number 5, if you're counting. And he says there are 7 primary features to the covenant, and 7 primary, a perfect number, and 3 secondary features. 3, again, a perfect number, right? We already talked about that, like the 10 Commandments. 3 that deal with God, 7 that deal with us. Vertical, horizontal, across. 7 primary features. But I think that the 3 secondary features are cooler. So I'm going to just go through the 7 really fast with you, and then I'm going to focus on the 3 secondary, because as Roman Catholics, they have everything. Those 3 secondary features are things that are very near and dear to us. And they were established 1,000 years before Jesus. So God says, I'm going to give you a kingdom. He already has it. Your kingdom will be a dynasty, meaning it's not like Saul had one shot and then it went to another family. Your dynasty means it stays in your family forever. For a very long time. And in this case, forever. So your kingdom will be a dynasty. The temple that you will build, or that his son will eventually build, will be the center of the religion of the entire world. He says, whoever the king is, so after David, whoever succeeds him in the dynasty, his line will be literally my adopted son. My adopted son. Think about Jesus, right? I mean, he's an adopted son, if you will, okay? He says, I will never disown this person, no matter how good or bad they are. The kingdom will never end, and it will be limitless. In other words, it will go everywhere. It'll have no limits. Those are the primary features. And they're cool. We get that. I mean, of course we want, and we say, Jesus is king forever. Jesus will never not be the king of everything, because his kingdom will have no end. And we're part of that. But listen to the 3 secondary features of the covenant with David. The first is the Queen Mother. And we would say Mary, the Blessed Mother, is the Queen Mother, because she is the mother of the king. And Solomon was having trouble with this guy, and this guy went to his mother, Solomon's mother. And I might be getting ahead of myself, but that's okay. When he went to Solomon, when Solomon was this is David's son. This is much later. I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, but I'm going to come back. People would go to Solomon's mother, Bathsheba, to ask her to intercede for them with her son. And it also says, there's a saying that says, everyone bows to the king, but the king only bows to one person, and that's to his mother, because she gave him life. That's cool. So the Queen Mother, for us, will be the Blessed Mother. The second is the idea of a prime minister who had the keys to all the doors in the kingdom. What did Jesus say to Peter? I give you the keys to the kingdom. So the prime minister 1,000 years before Jesus, then is that Peter takes that role in the kingdom of Christ. And that would be the Pope currently. I mean, so this is, we love the Pope, And the last one is there will be a thank offering rather than sin offerings. In this new kingdom, we're going to focus more on thanksgiving offerings rather than sin offerings, at least some of the time. And the Eucharist, which is our most important sacrament, actually means thanksgiving, the thanksgiving offering. So 1,000 years before Jesus, the three secondary features of the kingdom of David would be the Queen Mother, the Prime Minister, and the thank offering. So the Blessed Mother, the papacy, and the Eucharist for us. So that's big. I think that's really important. So for a while, everything seems perfect, of course, but David makes some big mistakes. And one day he is looking out from his rooftop, checking his capital city, and he looks over, you've probably heard this story, a woman, Bathsheba, bathing. And she's very beautiful, and he lusts after her, because he's a man, and he's a person. He's not in any way exempted from sins. Nobody is, right? Except Jesus and I guess Mary, they say, right? So that's fine. She is the wife of one of his chief army officers named Uriah the Hittite, he's called. And Uriah's wife is very beautiful, and David sends for her to come. He has sex with her. She gets pregnant. And so this is I went backward from Solomon, because Solomon's going to be their child together. He says, she sends word, I'm pregnant. Now what? My husband's at war. When he comes back, what's going to happen? And David, when Uriah comes back with all of his men, and this is what a good guy Uriah was. Uriah the Hittite and all of his men come back, and the men are all camped out like in the army camp. They can't go back to their wives yet. But Uriah can, and David sends for Uriah and gets him drunk a couple times and keeps trying to get him to go and have intercourse with his wife, because it's not too much time has passed, and he can hopefully not do the math, and right, you know what I mean? And so think that the baby is his. So his lust turns into adultery, which turns into plotting and deception, and eventually, because Uriah doesn't go. He says, I can't go home to my wife if my men can't go. He's a good leader. And so David doesn't know what to do, because they're going to get found out. And he calls his other leaders and says, his leaders of his armed forces, and he said, when you go to besiege the city, make sure that Uriah is at the front where the fighting is the worst, and then pull back. And they left him there, and he was killed on the battlefield. And that was David. It's murder. David plotted the murder of his right-hand man to cover up his sin, right? His adultery. And so we don't like David for a little while. And David's got a prophet named Nathan. So Nathan is to David what Samuel was to Saul. And they keep them in check with God. Make sure you're doing the right thing. And Nathan says, David, I'm going to tell you a story. It's a great story. He says, there was a man, and he had a little lamb that he loved so much. And he loved that lamb, and she used to drink from his own bowl, and she used to sleep in his arms and in his bosom. And next door was a very wealthy man that had thousands of sheep and everything he ever wanted. And when that man had people visit him, instead of taking one of his 1,000 lambs, he took that one guy's little lamb that was like a pet to him. Like he loved that little lamb. All he had was that little lamb, that little ewe lamb. And David said, man, that guy stinks. And the 4 words, I love these 4 words. Nathan says, you are that man. 4 words, you are that man, because of what you did. You had everything, and you have wives, children, you're the king, you have a kingdom, you have everything you ever want. And Uriah had a wife that he loved, and you've killed him. You took her from him, and then you killed him. You were that man. And he's like, right? And then that baby that was born died, did not live. The child of the adulterous affair between David and Bathsheba, but they have another child, and his name is Solomon. And Solomon is the wisest person, supposedly, that ever lived. So there's kind of a happy ending down the road for this family, but for a while, everything goes really south. David's got a son named Now remember, a lot of these kids are all half brothers and sisters because they all have different mothers, but they all have David as the father. Amnon rapes his sister Tamar. Amnon is killed by one of the other brothers as a revenge on him for raping his sister. And that brother is called Absalom. Absalom is very, very strong, handsome. They're all like perfect looking. David's entire family is like beauty queens and captains of the football team. I mean, they're all models and whatever, and perfect in every way. Absalom kills his brother, which makes David angry, even though that brother raped their sister, their half-sister. Absalom flees, fearing his father, but then is pardoned and returns, but then eventually rebels against him altogether and flees again. And in chapter 18 of the first, I think this is the first book of Kings at this point, it says, I'm just going to tell you the story. It says, Absalom is a fugitive at this point because he's leading a rebellion against his dad. And he's riding through the woods. He's got long jet black hair, like raven black. And I always tell the kids, the girls like to put their fingers through his hair. I'm making all that up because that's not in the Bible, but it makes them laugh. And you picture this guy with this long black hair that all the girls just go crazy over this guy. And he's riding on a mule. He's riding like on a donkey. This is important because we have somebody else riding on a donkey this Sunday. It's Palm Sunday coming up, right? Jesus, we're going to ride in to Jerusalem on a donkey, on a colt. He's riding on a colt. He's going through the woods. And his hair, which was his calling card, his hair gets caught. It's an interesting, weird story, but you can't help it but connect the dots. It's so there. He gets caught, and the colt keeps going, and he's hanging between heaven and earth. He's hanging from a tree between heaven and earth, the son of the king, who is riding on a colt. And all of a sudden, these guys from David's group come, and they take 3 spikes. And they don't crucify him, but they drive the 3 spikes into his heart. So, he's caught between heaven and earth, like Jesus is hanging on the cross between heaven and earth. The heir to the throne, at this point, 3 spikes to death. Not in the hands and the feet, but you know what I mean? You could just see this, unbelievable. Like even the crown of thorns, caught in his hair. I mean, can you not? I mean, if you can't see the parallels there, this is the kind of stuff that I go crazy over. And David, when the news reaches David that Absalom was coming, he was so happy because he was going to forgive his son. So Absalom and Jesus are not like the same type of person. Don't get me wrong. There's nothing the same about them, really. You know what I mean? But still, the father loves the son, no matter what. And when the news comes to him, he's like, where's my son? Where's that? And they say, they killed him. He grieves, my son, Absalom, my son. And he dies of grief, really, very shortly after that. And Solomon takes over. When it comes to Solomon, so a moment of silence for David. And Solomon comes. When he's asked what he wants, he says to the Lord, he says, all I want is wisdom. I want to be the best king I can be. I don't want wealth. I don't want power. I don't want revenge on my enemies. I just want wisdom. And he's given that and all those other things too, because God says, because you did not ask for those things, I'm going to give you those things. Unfortunately, he has 700 wives, 300 concubines. Again, these astronomical numbers of people. 700 wives. But again, you can see 700, 300. It symbolizes more than probably. But what he did was he makes Israel an imperial nation he married the daughters of all the other kings and queens of the countries all around the known world. So no one's going to attack him because their kids are in their family. They live there. Like our grandchildren are the same, right? Our grandkids live in this country. That's their grandpa too, or whatever. He made alliances with the entire world. He built a navy, which was unheard of back then. A navy, 1,000 years before Jesus. It became a major sea power, and kings and queens from all around the world came because he built the temple in Jerusalem. That was his pied de resistance. That's the greatest thing he did. And the Queen of Sheba, who was the most powerful woman that ever lived of all time. I forget what her name was. She had a name. The Queen of Sheba was and is currently still, of all time, she was the most powerful woman who ever lived. She controlled the greater part of the African continent. And Israel's this big. But she came to visit him. And so did kings from all around. And she would come to ask him the questions. That was what the temple was supposed to do, draw people from all around the world so that they could learn about the worship of the one true God, and God could then be the father of all the nations of the world. That's what he wanted. And they came on camels. The Queen of Sheba prefigures the three kings that came to Jesus in 2 miles outside of Jerusalem in Bethlehem. It was across the street, basically. On camels, with gold, with incense, with spices like myrrh, with precious gems. They praised the God of Israel. The temple was the greatest of his accomplishment. And this is the interesting thing about it. This is really important. The temple was built by the Gentile nations. Israel didn't have the craftsmen at that point because of their history. It was such a weird history, and they had been nomadic for so long. They didn't have the craftsmen who were skilled enough to build the greatest building that ever existed. So they brought the Gentile nations in, and eventually, though, those Gentiles were going to be not allowed in down the road. Isn't that sad? And that is really sad. And it was built by Gentiles, originally meant for all people. And when he dedicated the house of the Lord, he prayed first for his people and then for all the nations of the world, that they would all come there to encounter the one true God. Originally, so there's two cool things about the building, or the where the temple was situated. And if I had a blackboard or a whiteboard, I would draw this for you like I draw it for the kids. There was an ancient legend about this place, and there was an ancient tradition about this place, and they're equally cool. But the second one, well, they both connect to Christ. The first is that Abraham had taken Isaac to sacrifice him on that particular Mount Moriah, okay? The mount on which the temple was built, where the sacrifices of all the lambs would happen over the years, right? That was the legend. The ancient tradition was that the temple was built on a giant, and this is true, it was built on a giant outcropping of rock. This enormous rocky outcropping that they said was the capstone to the underworld, the world called Sheol or Hades, that they very much believed in, that they believed everyone went there. I talked about this in my homily this past weekend, that everyone went to Sheol. There wasn't like a heaven or a hell. It was just like everyone went to Hades. Everyone went to Sheol. It was the same underworld. Solomon's temple, therefore, sealed off the underworld, and the gates of Hades could not prevail upon it, could not prevail against it, because it was situated on that. So imagine if I had like a big bottle of pop here, and the bottle of pop is the underworld where all the souls are, right? And then the cap is this giant rock that looked like it's sealed off below it. And they built the temple on top of that rock that sealed off the netherworld. So when Jesus said to Peter, "You are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church," which is the new temple, "and the gates of hell," or the netherworld, "will not prevail against it." Everyone there would have known what he was saying more than we would, because they understood that tradition, that was where the gates to the netherworld was. And you wanted it sealed off. You don't want the souls all coming back, right? Like Samuel rising out of the, and being mad. Unfortunately, Solomon's pride got the best of him eventually. He became an apostate. His wives, and as good of an idea as this was, to bring wives from all around the world, they bring their traditions, they bring their gods, they bring their religions, which are pagan, unfortunately. And honey, Solomon, sweetie, would you build me a little altar for my God so I can worship my God from my country? And he should have said, no, there's only one God and we worship him here in this temple, that's it. There's no other gods, they're all false. But they prevailed on him. And so his kingdom became full of these little, they were called the high places. It sounds kind of nice, but they don't symbolize anything nice. The high places were the secret places up in the hills where Solomon built little altars for his wives to go worship their gods. So he brought idolatry into his country rather than bringing all the nations of the world there to worship the one true God. He allowed that all to kind of start to crumble. When Solomon died, his son Rehoboam succeeded him, and he was not a very good king, actually. He was young and stupid. And, if you think about it, palaces and temples don't come without a price tag. And so, where do you get the money for this? You tax the people. And they had been building like a lot. And the people's pocketbooks were like getting empty. And when Solomon dies and his son comes, they say, "Can you please give us a little bit of a break here?" All the elders of Israel went to him as a group and said, "We need a break. Like, your dad has taxed the crap out of us. And that's okay. We're happy that we live in like the greatest place ever, but we need a break. We're running out of our resources." Well, he says, "I'll get back to you." And he calls in all his young, stupid friends who were all born with silver spoons in their mouths and had never known anything but palaces and banquet feasts and riches and everything else and power. And they said, "Don't do that. You want to give up our lifestyle? You want this lifestyle? You can see how this goes." And they said, no. Like, the people are here to serve us, not the other way around. And it's like, no, the king is supposed to serve the people, not the other way around. You're the shepherd, like your grandpa, David. Like, have we lost that? And they said, nope. And they said, wrong answer. And Rehoboam and Jeroboam, right? All these names. He says, he actually goes up to the north and he takes over the northern kingdom and rips it away from Saul. So there's never a united kingdom ever again. Ever again. Until Jesus, I guess, and we're in his kingdom right now. We'll get to that. We're almost there. Jeroboam worried, though, up in the north, where the 10 tribes had rallied with him against Rehoboam in the south. He was afraid, well, what's going to happen when my people go to Jerusalem to worship God in the temple? So he builds 2 temples up in the north and puts a golden calf in each one of them. Just like the good old days, I guess. But like, that was the worst. You think the good old days, but it's the worst of days, right? And so for a long time, we're back to the golden calf again. I mean, it's everything's you can just see they're setting themselves up for failure. And then for the books of Kings and the books of Chronicles that follow, it bounces back and forth between the kings of the north and the kings of the south. And of all the kings of the north, only like 2, maybe out of like 20 are even mildly okay. But more in the south are. But it's like another roller coaster ride. A really good king who would bring all kind of religious reforms and bring the people back to God, and then some really crappy kings when idolatry would creep back in. And that's how they were judged, good or bad, by if they were bringing people to God or if they were bringing the idols. And throughout this time were people like King Ahab and his wife Jezebel, who, even if you don't really know their story, you know that Jezebel is not what you want to be referred to as, a Jezebel. You can count, because even if we're kids, we know that that's not a good person. Even though we don't really know maybe her whole story, but she was an idolater, and she brought gods from other countries, gods that people would actually sacrifice their children to, which is very sad and terrible. And she and her husband were nasty, and Elijah and Elisha, those 2 really important prophets from the Old Testament, were definitely in their faces, and along the way were in the faces of these good and bad kings, trying to keep them in the right path. So Elijah's really super famous, and Elisha is super famous. Elijah is credited with 7 miracles, and Elisha's the one that went up in the whirlwind, the chariot of fire, essentially, right? Swing low, sweet chariot. That's where that song is inspired by. He didn't die. He's like one of those people who has a mysterious ending, like Moses, who God buried himself, like Enoch, from the 7th person after Adam, who walked with God, and Elijah. And Elisha says, I want a double portion of your spirit when you go off to be with God. And he's credited with 14 miracles. So he does get that double portion. Next, we're going to move into a period of the exile, which is the second saddest time for the Israelite people. There's 2 exiles, one in the north called Assyrian exile, and one in the south called the Babylonian exile. Remember, we have a divided kingdom, north and south. Israel, Judea. Okay, Israel, Judea. There's an ominous threat growing from the northeast. So for your direction, coming this direction from Assyria, which is northeast of Israel. The Assyrians came in and wiped them out. They took the 10 tribes that lived up there, and they had a terrible policy of resettling entire populations. So this is how I describe it to the kids. You are going to be separated. You're going to be resettled to another place. But your family's not going with you. They're all going somewhere else. It's almost like the concentration camps and things like that in the last century. Like when families never saw each other again. They just never saw each other again. They took your daughters and they put them on this train, and they took your sons and they put them on this train, and they took you and they put you on this train, and off you went to various concentration camps where you were never seen from again. Essentially, that was happening to the Jewish people many, 700 years before Jesus. 722 is when this happened, 722. And they would resettle you one place, and your husband or wife another place. Your children would go different places. Your neighbors would go different places. You literally were dropped into a place where you didn't know a single person. So there you are. And they put people from all around the world alone, right, all from different places with people they don't know, into your old neighborhood or your own country. So here you are with a bunch of strangers. And there were a few people still left behind. They didn't round up every farmer and every single poor person. They left some people there. But what happened was, and Nineveh was the capital city of Assyria. And that's where the prophet Jonah went, in the whale, remember? Or in the big fish stick, a large fish. That's where he was supposed to go. That was his job, is to try and convert the Ninevites later. This comes later, though. So the kingdom of Israel disappeared from history. The 10 tribes were lost. They're called the lost tribes. The lost tribes. They're gone. And the few people who were left, the poor, I said the farmers, etc., married with those people that the Assyrians had brought to inhabit their empty cities. And they became the Samaritans in that middle section. So here's another geography lesson. At this point, but it's still called Israel in the north. Now, and Judea's in the south. They're still solid. And in the middle now, there's a place called Samaria. And that's where Jesus has to travel if he wants to visit his relatives who live in the southern part or in the northern, right? He grew up in the northern part. But to travel to Jerusalem, you had to go through Samaria. But that's not a place of friendship and I'll get to that in a minute. So more prophets come. Isaiah, Jeremiah. Next, from the southeast comes another threat about 150 years later. 140, let's say. Let me think, 130 years later, the Babylonians come and they attack the southern kingdom of Judah. The difference is that they didn't separate you from your families. They took you into exile, but they took you as a group. And that's really, really important. They burned down the temple, they burned down the palace, and they carted those people away, but they kept them together. And that's the difference. There's a legend that says Jeremiah, the prophet who we've all heard of, hid the Ark of the Covenant. And never found again. If you want to look at stories from the Babylonian period, look at the book of the prophet Daniel. Eventually, that Babylonian kingdom fell to the hands of the Medes, then the Persians. And when the Persians came, Cyrus was the king of the Persians, and now they've been in exile for like a long time, like 70 years or something like that. And he said, what are all these Jewish people doing here? And they said, well, the Babylonians, they resettled them. He says, they can go home. So he became a hero. The Persian king became almost a Messiah figure for the Jewish people because he said, go home, rebuild your country, rebuild your temple. And a small people who were left, a very small remnant were left, and they traveled back and they were still solid as a rock as far as their family ties go. The king, they knew who they were. They knew that they were Judeans. They knew that they were from the tribe of Judah, the tribe of Benjamin. It was still there. Very little, but they returned and began to rebuild their lives. So this becomes the period now of the restoration. And it's a sad time because they're at rock bottom, and it would never, the temple would never, it would always pale in comparison to the original of Solomon. And this is really so sad. The people in the middle, and I feel really bad for them. The Samaritans were like, hey, they're still considered like their cousins. You know what I mean? Like we're still, like it all sounds like a Harry Potter movie. Like pure blood. The Judeans were pure bloods. The Samaritans were now mudbloods, if you know what that means, a mixed blood. And when the Samaritans came down and they heard that the Judeans had come back from exile and were going to rebuild the temple, that was their temple too that was destroyed all the 100 years or however long before. They came down and said, welcome home, and let us help you rebuild the temple. And the Judeans said, no, thank you. You are not in our family anymore. You're too mixed with all the other nations. You've intermarried with them. And our religion will be a pure religion. That's all they cared about, their pure religion. Isn't that sad? And again, it sounds like a Harry Potter book, Like it looked like a glorious promises that God had made with Abraham would never come about. Yet the prophets kept saying that it would. The restoration of the remnant of the Jewish people was only the beginning. The true heir to the Davidic kingdom, the anointed one, the Christ, would still come. That's their message. He's still going to come down the road. You cannot ever give up hope for that because they were starting to lose hope because they just had nothing. Next came the period of the Greeks, and you've heard of Philip of Macedon, right? Macedonia. You've heard of his son, I'm sure, called Alexander the Great, right? This is the Greek Empire, giant. Spanned the world, the known world at that time. After Alexander's death, his empire was divided into 3 parts. The part that the Holy Land was in ended up being ruled by the really nasty, horrible person who thought he was God in the flesh. That's what he called himself, God in the flesh. No ego there, right? I'm God in the flesh. Nice to meet you. He gave the high priesthood to the highest bidder, because he could, and turned the Jerusalem temple into a temple of Zeus. So during the end of the Greek period, which was a really sad period, there was resistance came through a man and his family called the Maccabees. And you can read their stories too in the Old Testament, right? The Protestant churches, for the most part, do not have the books of Maccabees included in their scriptures. So you need to look at like the New American Bible or the ones that we use. There was an old priest. He was an old priest, this Maccabee guy, and his 5 sons. And they retreated to the countryside and started organizing this resistance. And they never gave up. And little by little, they took it back from the Greeks. Within 3 years, they purified and rededicated the temple, because the Greek guy, I can't remember what his name is, something Antiochus Epiphanes, or something like that. And he actually brought in and sacrificed a pig on the altar in the Jerusalem temple, which was like the highest desecration that you could do. To sacrifice a pig on the Jerusalem altar, like the worst thing ever. This family and the resistance pushed outward, and eventually, and can't you hear like remnants of like Star Wars trilogies, and the rebellion, and these giant really evil empires that come, and where do you think these are all inspired? In our history, right here in our history, they're all there if you think about it, right? They pushed outward and eventually regained control of what had been David's kingdom, literally. By 125 years before Jesus, for the first time in half of a millennium, Israel was again an independent territory. They had taken it back 1 inch at a time, just like Abraham had taken it 1 inch at a time. Just like beginning with his wife's grave, his plot of land. Remember Abraham all that time ago? Just like Israel had, starting with the city of Jericho, 1 city at a time, they took it back. This resistance order, 125 years BC, took it finally back, and it was almost exactly the same territory that David had ruled over 1,000 years before Jesus, so 900 years before. And all they needed now was a king from David's line. We need a king from David's line, because it has to be from his line. We won't accept anybody else. There was a guy named John Hyrcanus. He became the high priest in 63 BC. You can see we're getting close. And we have like 5 minutes left. We're very close to the end. 63 BC, he becomes the high priest in Jerusalem. He Judaizes the entire country. What that means is he made it very strictly religious. He wanted all the Greek influences completely gone, which is not a bad thing, but he tore down the Samaritans' temple, because when they were offered to help them rebuild theirs, they said, no, we don't want your help, remember? They built their own. This guy destroyed their temple for no reason, other than he just wanted to destroy it. So then the Samaritans hate the Jews even more than they already did. When he died, John Hyrcanus, his son succeeded him and proclaimed himself king. He's not of David's line, and he's a priest. So you can't be. Remember, you can't be. The priests anointed the kings. It's a separate office. Until Jesus, it's a separate thing. Everything crumbled again. Rome shows up. So this is how close we are. In 40 BC, a ruthless thug, claiming to be, ready, a Jew returning from the exile, persuaded the Romans to give him the throne of Judea, and his name was Herod the Great. He was actually an Edomite, but not Jewish. Now, they had similar, way thousands of years ago, they all sprang from Abraham, but this is not a Jew. Herod the Great was insane, perverted beyond what I can talk about in church, paranoid. He murdered 3 of his own sons because he was thinking that they were plotting to kill him and take over his kingdom. I think he killed his mother-in-law too. I mean, and now, I mean, the mother-in-law jokes, you know what I mean? But like, you don't kill your own kids, like, yeah, your mother-in-law, okay, yeah, no, I'm just joking. But, he did refurbish the temple, though, in Jerusalem, which is a very important thing. He was incredibly wealthy. He did things like roads, he helped the Romans build beautiful roads that went everywhere. He built palaces, he built the temple. He made Jerusalem like what its former glory was supposed to be, right? With this temple that he refurbished. Well, remember, Solomon's temple was destroyed completely, like to the ground. The second temple will also be destroyed with only part of one wall left to this day. You know that, right? The Western Wall, they call it, the Wailing Wall, where the Jewish people go and pray and cry, thinking about their long, sordid history. But he did restore the Jerusalem temple to a magnificent scale. I have read that I've never been there. And of course, we're never going to go there because it doesn't exist anymore. There were like a cluster of grapes. And the cluster of grapes was solid gold, and 6 feet, each of them were 6 feet high, all the way around. Like, it was just gold inside and out. They said that when people were approaching Jerusalem from the east and the sun was behind them, it looked like the sun was in front of them because it shined so brightly on the gold of the temple that it blinded you. It was solid gold, plated all the way around. And so the Romans come with their peace. That's why Jesus was born at that time, because it was the first time ever that the whole world was at peace. When Jesus came, the world was at peace. No one was fighting with anybody. So he truly was the Prince of Peace. There was worldwide trade routes, so the gospel could go in every direction. It never could have done that before. And Herod's expensive building programs equaled an economic boom that hadn't existed in like 1,000 years. And that's the world in which Jesus was born. The end. There you go. So I hope you liked it. Right? We covered a lot of ground. So again, I hope that this could be the first of many of these series, as we look into the future, to bring people into this amazing place, right? And just to come here and learn about God and our faith. And so thank you for your 5 weeks of coming here and trusting me with your time.